Ruth, do you have any insights? And I know you shared some of it in Dr. Bethel's series also, but do you have any new insights since the last revision of the book?
Well, I think that one of the things that's been increasingly I'm more aware of is the impact of language. I mean, that maybe sounds kind of basic, but when we did our cultural identity box, where if you're a foreigner, if you don't look like someone and you don't think like someone, your identity is clear, and so how you relate is clear. And then, of course, the whole issue of being a hidden immigrant, where you may look like the dominant culture, but you may not think like them, which is certainly what many of us have at reentry or are adopted. You may look different, but you think more like the dominant, and people don't expect you to be like them, or a mirror where you're just alike. People have said to me, and I think it's absolutely true, they said I need to add language there, because sometimes how you speak can identify you or surprise people. And so that's been an interesting thing, the whole issue of how bilingualism is important. There's so many new studies on that. But I think the other thing that is a growing awareness of mine that isn't finished thinking, because I do want to say we need everybody's minds, because this is an evolving process and a growing dynamic that's happening in our world, is that even in the international schools, while we can look really diverse, I'm hearing from some that when I go to the school, I have to be very Western, and people don't know who I am when we go home. So maybe we need to become more aware of the differences, even for a lot of kids in international school, between their home culture and their school culture. And these are all things that I keep growing and keep thinking about, but even back to where these topics apply, I've really become aware how, even for immigrants and immigrant children, many of these topics are very relevant, because in today's world, unlike 50 years ago, so many kids go back and forth between their parents' culture, their grandparents, where their grandparents are, and wherever they're living. And when they go back, they are also in that hidden immigrant category, because they go back and people wonder, how can you be a Kenyan or an Indian or a Chinese or whatever, and you don't behave that way after you're coming here. So all of these things are all evolving, and they're wonderful things to think about, how we use our gifts in the global workplace. Just everything is it feels like we barely got started. There's so much to still think about. That's why we need your generation.
And continue to pass the torch, right?
We're trying.
And
mine's getting dim.
Yeah, and you're right. Everything is changing. I remember you were talking about on Dr. Bethel's show how, because the world is becoming more globalized, the work that we had to do, or you all had to do maybe 20 years ago, is different. It looks different from what the work we have to do today. And
Right.
I know back in your day, before the book came out, there was no Skype, there was no Facebook or anything, and so communication was different. I remember listening to my parents' stories of how they used to part, from one another, how they used to bid farewell, and it involved them being on ships, and one person on the ship throwing a long ribbon that's supposed to land on the ground of where the ones watching them leave are supposed to catch. And then as the ship slowly drifts out, then you're supposed to hold the both ends of the string, or one person holds one end of the string and the other one the other, as you bid farewell. And then the whole ride on the ship is a completely longer process than just going on a plane, showing your boarding pass, sitting there for maybe 2 to 6 hours, and then leaving the plane with your boarding, with your luggage and going home, maybe within a day, if you're traveling internationally, within 24 hours usually. And so even our whole perspective on transition and leaving and arriving is different from when it was 20, 30 years ago. One very helpful chapter in Third Culture Kid.
Can I make one comment on that?
Sure, sure.
I just want to say I do feel like we're in TCKid phase 2, because it's kind of like the basic understanding is there. Now, what do we do with it? And what you guys have done with it is phenomenal. I want to thank Bryce Royer and all of you who have followed in his footsteps, because you've made it available to the world. Dave Pollock worked his tail off, and Mike can tell you more about that in his interview in another day. I think he will. He went around the world physically every year, school by school, trying to get the topic going. People didn't believe in it then. It took a long time, but it's a very labor-intensive way to do it. One day somebody sent me a link to something called TCKid.com, wondered if I'd ever seen it, and I couldn't believe it. Here this was on the social media, on the network, and what do you got, 21,000 people or more just on your site? And I
including
thought,
every Facebook groups.
Yeah, you have taken it to that place where the common person knows it. That couldn't happen without what you guys do. And I want to thank you for that, but also that's part of the change, that it is, the information has become more available. And you guys are key people, and Bryce, if you're listening, I want to thank you too, because you know you had a vision and you've done it.
Thank you, Bryce.
Thank you, Myra and Aaron and everybody else.
And you. And
Myra,
thank you, Dave Pollock. Sure.
Oh, I just wanted to add, when you made the list of things that didn't exist, you didn't mention email.
Yes.
Just thinking about the fact that we, when I first, so it was even more so, but Ruth and I probably both remember the blue air forms that took.
Absolutely.
They were the speediest little fold-up light, paper letters, and they would take 2 weeks there, 2 weeks back. So the fastest, if you, unless you can get through by phone, which was sketchy in a lot of places, the fastest was 4 weeks for communication. When email came out, it was just this amazing way to connect, reconnect across miles, and it was affordable.
I went 4 years. I didn't talk to my parents once because there was no phone connection. And even these little blue air forms, by the time I sent them and they answered me, I couldn't even remember what wonderful problem I'd had that I'd even written them about. Right. So it was a big deal. Right. But anyway, you guys are making it happen now for everybody.
I use that too, the par avion. And I do remember. And actually back when I was in high school, what my friends and I used to do, and it was, for me, it was a ritual. It was a ritual for me to be able to deal with the homesickness and missing my friends, because a lot of people who didn't live this lifestyle don't realize that you're constantly on the move. This didn't happen when you're a teenager and you're on vacation. This is what it was from year to year, or maybe every 2 or 3 years. And what my friends and I used to do as part of our ritual for dealing with missing each other was we would make cassette tapes of each other. Because long-distance phone calls were too expensive, we would make cassette tapes of us just recording how our day was, and updates, and high school gossip, and we even recorded segments of our favorite comedians that we used to listen to when we were all together in the same city, and send that, and it would be really creative. And not to say that social media isn't creative now, but back in the day, you had to be super creative to keep in touch, and be able to share your emotion in letters and on cassette tapes or other forms where Skype and Facebook now do. And so actually what we're all doing is naming our experiences as a third culture kid. What I just did was naming my experience of how it was for me missing my friends. And for me, that's why, for me, one of the most important sections in this book was that section on what can adult third culture kids do. And for those who have this edition, it's on page 251, what ATCKs, adult third culture kids, can do, and it's under the chapter of It's Never Too Late. And there's a lot of other valuable information in that chapter, how parents can help, but the naming our experiences, which includes naming our behavioral patterns, naming fears, naming our losses, wounds, and our choices. This, as you put in the book, Ruth, it's a process of simply putting a name to our past. And for me, Letter Never Sent is also a journey of that. You know, your experience as a missionary kid in the past. Get more into Letters Never Sent a little bit later because there's valuable information in this too. It's very emotional, but for anyone who took the challenge to read this book and go through the emotions while reading this book, you all would agree that it's valuable information because it talks about the human experience of the loss in a very raw form, in a very creative form, because it's almost like we're reading her journal. And but before we go into that book, and in a little while, I want to open up the lines. I believe on YouTube there is a section on the right side where you can submit comments or questions. We want to be able to take comments or questions from our live audience about how the chapter on naming our losses or naming your losses, your experiences, has impacted your life. But while we're doing that, Ruth, I wanted to ask, why is it so important to be able to name our experiences? Why is that so effective?
I think that language and having a name for something empowers me to be able to work with it. It says the truth will set you free. And if I don't even know what I'm feeling, if I can't put a name on it, all I can do is feel it and react to it. I have no way to make a choice about what I'm going to do with this. And for me, the story really was, I had this place that I had this incredibly wonderful life. I loved my life as a child. I loved growing up in Nigeria. It was wonderful. And I loved all the people I met. Then, as I said, I went back to the States. I had that bad year. Then I, sort of got even keeled. But later on, we went back when David, my husband, was a senior in medical school. We went back to Africa, and it was my first time back in 12 years. And I think this world I had shut away, when I look back at it now, kind of popped up again. But of course, I didn't know what to do with it. We went back to the States. We moved to St. Louis. Dave was an intern. He was gone every other night. And I think when I think about my life, I always took care of any pain or grief by staying terribly busy. Now we were in a new place. I had a new baby. I didn't have any friends. Long distance was very expensive. For the first time in my entire life, I got depressed. I couldn't understand it because I've never thought of myself as a depressive person. So that was, I still didn't have language. I got angry easy. I got depressed. I didn't understand. And that was a process of again, I didn't even go to a therapist because I don't know, I guess I was proud or something. But we moved and we went in the Navy and life got better and I thought, okay, I'm fine. But then when my daughter was going to leave, all these feelings came back and I thought, okay, this is one of the secrets, guys. When you have feelings that you don't have any understanding, because in my brain, I had no reason for it. I had a good husband. I had 3 children I loved my life. What is this place? Something's going on that connects to something else. But I couldn't work with it until I could figure it out. So I finally thought it must have something to do with my leaving. And that was when I began to write Letters Never Sent, just totally as a journal. And suddenly I realized that there was this world of losses and that I'd lost, my family, I'd lost my world, and that even though I'd had this wonderful life, there were some very specific places of loss. And I think this is one of the big challenges for TCKs and others who live cross-culturally is our losses are very invisible because nobody died. There were no divorces. There was no alcoholism. I was never abused. So I had this almost perfect life. And as I began to name the losses, then I can have choices. What am I going to do with it? What I found is when I'm having a feeling, I say, what am I feeling? And seeing if I can get a word for it. And then maybe when did I feel like that before is kind of how I process now. But anyway, I was, as I began to understand that, then I began to realize I could make choices. When I realized that my anger when somebody's going to leave is really a defense against them leaving. Instead of withdrawing, I could say, hang on, and say to my friends, you know what, this is the way I do life too often. I don't want to do it that way. So if I start to do it, you call me, but it also helps me make a choice. I don't have to do it that way. I'm not locked in to my old patterns. And if I don't have language, if I don't have understanding, I'm just locked into responding and feeling. But I can't make a choice on how to change. And that's why, to me, it's really important to understand. And also some things like understanding I lost the world that I fit in. Okay, like I said before, I knew I fit in Nigeria very well. Then I got back to the States and I didn't. Well, is it because I'm crazy? It's not because I'm crazy. It's because I'm like anybody else. I learned to live in a culture that I grew up in, and I knew how to relate to different people. Now I'm in a different place, so I have to learn it again. It's not going to happen automatically. So instead of thinking, what's the problem with me, I can say, okay, this is how it is. Now what am I going to do about it? And for me, that's just been a huge thing. Changed my life.
Yeah, and I can understand how it really would be difficult to not be able to relate to that or not be able to understand that unless you really went through it yourself. And so for me, this is why we're here, to be able to share our stories, to be able to bridge that gap, you know, for those who may maybe not be able to relate, but to also to be able to open up avenues for all of us to be able to express ourselves so that we can reach out, and hopefully those who are in the non-TCK community can reach out back to us. It's a two-way street, and we just really appreciate those who are tuned in today. Before we
I think that one of the things is, if I understand my issue of hidden loss, people of all backgrounds have hidden losses. And often they also struggle because they don't know what it was they lost beyond maybe the obvious. Maybe a child died, but what did you lose? Yes, you lost a child, but you lost the dream of the wedding. You lost the dream of the grandkids. You know, there's things that go with the loss that we don't maybe stop to think. So I think that's also one of my most connecting places to people who are not TCKs. It's that the issue of losses in everybody's life, and how do we process. Back to you.
Michael, did you have anything to add?
Well, I had a lot of thoughts while I was going through, but I think that it's true. One of the things that occurs to me is just what Ruth was saying about the commonality of experiences. Because we're such a global society, there's so much change. Just the fact of feeling out of place, of feeling like you're not understood, people looking at you and making a judgment based on how you look, how you dress, perhaps your accent, and things the hidden stories. And just, I think it's really a call to our humanity, to recognize in each other the stories, to never underestimate that each human being who walks into your life, your circle, has their unique story, carries their wounds and their losses, has strong potential, and so I think that's a great view in mind to keep as we talk specifically, about TCKs and understanding them, understanding ourselves, who we are, and what we bring, and perhaps what that implies for what we do. What do we do with it? But there's a common story, and the things that we learn, like Ruth was saying, are things that we can apply as we reach out to each other.
And that's a very important point, because what I do notice is that with the friendships I've made, through thirdculturekid.com and other venues, I noticed that we all have a special empathy. We all have that capacity to empathize with people who don't have any similarities with us whatsoever, because we grew up moving around so much that our countrymen and women were the world. The world was our countrymen and women. And in a sense, we learned how to relate to one another outside the categories of race and class and nationality and religion even, and all sorts of categories that, in a sense, from what I observe, we're categoryless, in a sense. And we really literally live in between worlds. We think in between worlds. We relate to one another in between worlds. We're in that middle place where we're very comfortable with gray areas. We're very comfortable with what the world might see as fence sitting, but yet that's where we are, and it's part of our valid identity. And so I believe that's where our gift is, to be able to relate from that place and be able to bridge people and bring gaps instead of bridging gaps and just bringing people together and pointing out, like you said, that human experience, that those commonalities, because in the end, and I know, Ruth, this is what you always say, we're first human. First we're human before we're even a TCK.
Absolutely. I was going to say, that's my experience. It's shaped me profoundly, but it isn't at the core of who I am. At the core of who I am is being a person who's relational and creative and emotional, just like everybody else in the world. And everybody in the world is shaped by their experience, their background. And the fact that we talk about this doesn't make us better than or so different from, but everybody, I think, needs to understand the way and process in which they were shaped by their story, by their experience. And when you do that, whatever story or background you're from, then you can use it. You have something that's you can use to reach out to other people, and that's why I work and do what I do, because I believe that we can use the gifts in new ways, and we can also work with others who may not have our story, but share our humanity.
And speaking of stories, Erin, do you have any stories or comments coming in from our audience? I know we have a little bit of a technical difficulty with adding the link to our tckid.com page, but I know that it will be there as a replay. And right now, hopefully all the people joining us are viewing us from our Facebook fan page.